What happens when a nation's most important industry grinds to a halt? The 1958 Cuban Sugar Workers Strike wasn't just about wages or working conditions. It became a turning point in Cuba's march toward revolution. Sugar was the lifeblood of the island, but when its workers put down their machetes and walked off the fields, they sent a message that shook the foundations of power. Let's set the stage. By the 1950s, Cuba's economy was heavily reliant on sugar. It was the island's main export, responsible for employing hundreds of thousands of workers and generating massive profits for landowners and foreign investors, especially those from the United States. Sugar plantations stretched across the Cuban countryside, and during the harvest season, known as Zafra, the island buzzed with activity. Sugar wasn't just an industry, it was a way of life for many Cubans. But while the sugar barons and foreign corporations thrived, the workers toiling in the fields faced long hours, dangerous conditions, and poverty wages. These laborers, known as cañeros, were the backbone of the Cuban economy, yet they lived on the margins of society. Discontent had been brewing for years, and by 1958, the cañeros had had enough. They were ready to stand up and fight for their rights, even if it meant going toe-to-toe with the powerful regime of Fulgencio Batista. Fulgencio Batista, who had seized power in a military coup in 1952, ruled Cuba with an iron fist. His government was corrupt, repressive, and closely aligned with American business interests. Under Batista, foreign companies, especially from the U.S., gained even more control over Cuba's lucrative sugar industry. Workers had little recourse when it came to improving their conditions, and any attempt at unionizing or protesting was swiftly crushed by the government's security forces. But by the late 1950s, anti-Batista sentiment was spreading like wildfire. Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement was gaining momentum in the mountains, and the urban population, students, intellectuals, and workers, were becoming increasingly disillusioned with Batista's regime. The sugar workers' strike in 1958 would become a pivotal moment in this growing unrest. In early 1958, as the Zafra was about to begin, tensions between sugar workers and plantation owners boiled over. The cañeros had been pushing for better wages and working conditions, but the plantation owners, backed by the Batista government, were resistant to change. The Cuban Workers' Confederation, CTC, a national union that was supposed to represent labor interests, had been co-opted by Batista's government, leaving the workers with little support from official channels. Despite the risks, the cañeros decided to take matters into their own hands. On March 14, 1958, they called for a nationwide strike, demanding higher wages, safer working conditions, and better job security. It was a bold move, one that would have devastating consequences for the sugar industry and Batista's regime. The strike spread quickly across the island, with workers in major sugar-producing regions like Oriente and Camagüey refusing to harvest the cane. Sugar mills were shut down, and the once bustling fields fell silent. For Batista's government, this was a disaster. Sugar was Cuba's most important export, and the strike threatened to cripple the economy at a time when Batista was already struggling to maintain control. As the strike gained momentum, Batista's government responded with brutal force. Soldiers and police were sent to break up strikes, arresting workers and union leaders. Striking cañeros were beaten, jailed, and even killed in some cases. In rural areas, the military patrolled the fields, trying to intimidate workers into returning to their jobs. But the repression only fueled the workers' resolve. The violence became a rallying cry for other sectors of Cuban society, further igniting anti-Batista sentiment. Workers in other industries, transportation, construction, and education, began to organize their own strikes in solidarity with the sugar workers. The strike was no longer just about wages and working conditions. It was a direct challenge to Batista's rule. While the sugar workers fought on the front lines of the strike, Fidel Castro and his revolutionary forces were waging a guerrilla war against Batista in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Castro, always a keen strategist, saw the potential of the strike to weaken Batista's grip on power. He encouraged the sugar workers to keep fighting, promising that the revolution would bring about the social and economic justice they sought. Many sugar workers were sympathetic to the revolutionary cause. Some even joined Castro's forces, fleeing the fields to take up arms in the mountains. Others continued to strike, inspired by the hope that the revolution would finally bring an end to the corruption and inequality that had plagued their lives for so long. The 1958 sugar workers' strike had a ripple effect that extended far beyond the fields. By disrupting the sugar industry, the strike undermined one of the pillars of Batista's power: the support of the wealthy landowners and foreign corporations who depended on the cañeros for their profits. The strike also highlighted Batista's inability to control the growing unrest across the island. As the economy sputtered, Batista's government became even more isolated. Internationally, the regime's brutality was condemned, and domestically, Batista's support base began to crumble. The sugar workers had sent a powerful message. They were no longer willing to accept exploitation, and they would fight for their rights, no matter the cost. By the end of 1958, the sugar workers' strike, combined with Castro's growing revolutionary movement, had Batista on the ropes. The Cuban economy was in shambles, and the regime's violent repression only deepened the divide between the government and the people. On New Year's Day 1959, Batista fled Cuba, and Fidel Castro's forces marched triumphantly into Havana. The revolution had succeeded, and the cañeros had played a crucial role in bringing down Batista's regime. Their strike had shown the power of organized labor and how economic disruption could be used as a tool for political change. The legacy of the 1958 sugar workers' strike lives on in Cuban history. It wasn't just a strike for better wages. It was a symbol of resistance against exploitation and tyranny. The workers who stood up to Batista's regime paved the way for the broader social and economic reforms that would come after the revolution. If you found this story of resistance and resilience inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. The story of the Cuban Revolution is filled with moments like this. Moments where ordinary people came together to make extraordinary change. Peace, love, and stay curious, my friends.